morning. We're studying the book of Genesis, and we're talking about Abraham, and it occurred to me that someone might say, well, how come we're New Testament people? Why are we getting bogged down back here in Genesis reading about Abraham? So I jotted down a few texts. If we're... Morning, Ed.
Good morning, good morning.
We're reading our New Testament. We come along to Matthew chapter 8, and Jesus heals the servant of a centurion, a Gentile Roman officer. And the Roman officer says, I'll go to your house and heal you. The Roman officer says, you don't have to go to the house. I know how to give orders. And you just say that he'll be healed. And Jesus says, I tell you the truth, I have not found anyone in Israel with such great faith. So I say to you, So I say to you that many will come from the east and the west and will take their places at the feast with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob in the kingdom of heaven. But the subjects of the kingdom will be thrown out into darkness where there will be weeping and gnashing of teeth. Okay, if we don't read the Old Testament, think, well, who's this Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob you're talking about, Jesus? Then we go to Luke's gospel, and where John the Baptist is in his active preaching, and he's saying to them, you brood of vipers, who warned you to flee from the coming wrath? Produce fruit in keeping with repentance, and do not begin to say to yourselves, we have Abraham as our father. For I tell you that out of these stones, God can raise up children to Abraham. So here we are again mentioning Abraham, and if you don't know who Abraham is, how do you know what John the Baptist is talking about? Then perhaps the most interesting of these kind of texts is in the 8th chapter of the Gospel of John. We're very familiar with this because this is the place where Jesus says, you shall know the truth, and the truth will make you free. Yeah. But find my place here. So he says, he's having this sort of debate with the political leaders, and he says to them okay, come on now. John 8:31. To the Jews who had believed in him, Jesus said, if you hold to my teaching, you are really my disciples. Then you will know the truth, and the truth will set you free. They answered him, now this is the critics, he's talking to his disciples, but the critics answered, we are Abraham's descendants and have never been enslaved by anyone. How can you say that you will set us free? I tell you the truth, everyone who sins is a slave to sin, he says. Then he says, I know that you are Abraham's descendants, yet you are ready to kill me because you have no room for my words. I'm telling you what I have seen in the Father's presence, and you do not want to hear from your father. And they said, Abraham is our father. He said, if you were Abraham's children, then you would do the things Abraham did. But as it is, you are determined to kill me, a man who has told you the truth that I heard from God. Abraham did not do such things, he says. And you are doing the things of your own father. He goes on to say your father is really the devil. And then finally, he says to them, I tell you the truth, before Abraham was born, I am. And they picked up stones to stone him. They say to him, how can you say you know Abraham when you're not 50 years old yet, and Abraham was all those years ago? So now, if this wasn't enough, Matthew and Luke both start their gospel with genealogies in which they trace Jesus' lineage back to Abraham. And then we have Paul in Romans and in Galatians, speaking of Abraham as sort of the original man of faith. Mm-hmm. It was Abraham first that God said, that the text says that his faith was credited to him as righteousness. And then we have in the book of Hebrews, the 11th chapter, it's talking about those heroes of the faith, and the very main one is Abraham, who God said, go to a land where I will show you, and said Abraham went, not really knowing where he was going. He'd never been there. And said this shows that he was a man of great faith, and he continued to live by this faith. And he said, the Hebrew writer says, because he was living in temporary tents in a land that didn't belong to him, because God had said he would give it to him. And he was waiting for that place that is of God, that city whose builder and maker is God. So reading the New Testament, if you didn't know who Abraham was, you'd find a little difficulty understanding a number of things that the New Testament says. In the 7th chapter of Acts, Stephen is dragged before the Sanhedrin because he's talking about Jesus, and they're trying to stop that. And he makes his defense to the Sanhedrin, and the first thing in his defense is to talk about Abraham. He says, our father Abraham, our father, he's a Jewish person too. Our father Abraham was called by God and followed the ways of God. So Abraham's a very important character. In fact, we're studying Romans on Wednesday night, and I'm seeing that Paul is saying to us that Abraham is the original man of grace. One thing about the Bible, that it gives us heroes to look up to, but it also tells us the weaknesses of its heroes. We have David, who's the man after God's own heart. We think, well, David must be perfect then. But one of the great stories we know about David is his sin with Bathsheba and his repentance. So it was because of his repentance that he was a man after God's own heart. It wasn't because he was flawless and never did anything wrong. Same is true of Abraham, and as we read Abraham's story, we went through a lot of it last week. We want to kind of pick up and review this morning. Abraham, you kind of have a beginning point, and then Abraham seems to kind of go off. You have the idea that God talks to Abraham every day, and yet if you read it carefully, you see that years pass between the times that God talks to Abraham. And in those passing years, Abraham wavers a little, and you wonder about some of the things that he says and does. Okay, so the beginning of the 12th chapter of Genesis, we have this first recording in Genesis, though Stephen in Acts 7 says it really began while he was still in Ur of the Chaldees, which was a great city in that day, one of the foremost cities in the world. And God said, Stephen says, Abraham saw the glory of God while he was still in Ur of the Chaldees, and God called him to leave that city with all its modern advantages and go someplace else. And so he traveled 600 miles up the river. But then God had said, leave your family. And it's obvious that when he leaves Ur of the Chaldees, he takes his idolatrous father with him, or his father is maybe leading the group. We were told clearly that his father was an idolater. So then they get upriver to this very nice place, where there is a good settlement of people. And they settle down and stay there until Abraham's father dies. And then the 12th chapter says, the Lord had said to Abraham, leave your country, your people, and your father's household, and go to the land I will show you. So at this point then, he leaves the family that's there, but he still takes Lot with him. And Lot becomes a significant character in this story. Now, I mentioned last week that it doesn't say anything about Lot having a wife. It definitely says that Abraham had a wife. Abram at this time his name hadn't been changed yet. And his wife's name was Sarai, and then it's changed to Sarah. But anyway, at this point in chapter 12 of Genesis, we're told that God said, I will make you into a great nation, and I will bless you, and I will make your name great, and you will be a blessing. You will bless those who bless you. I will bless those who bless you, and whoever curses you, I will curse. And all peoples on earth will be blessed through you. This is that beginning of grace that God is saying, I have a plan. One of the reasons that we study the Old Testament is to get to know God in a deeper way. We know God most intimately through Jesus, his son. But the Old Testament shows us God as years went by for man, and yet God is always God. So in Genesis, we talked last week about the fact that it goes all the way back to creation and makes it very clear that the God we're talking about created human beings. Now, how he created them, Genesis isn't a book of scientific expertise. It's a book of faith. So it just tells us that Abraham created mankind and that there was an exchange at this point.
Not Abraham.
Pardon?
God. You said Abraham.
Oh, God created. Oh, yeah, sometimes my brain thinks one thing and my mouth says something else.
I knew you didn't mean it.
But you know that. So God created man, and at this point we see God having a relationship with human beings. One of the questions we always ask is, why in the world did God create humans in the first place? It seems to us as we look at it, though it's not explained to us, the Bible tells us a lot of things to receive by faith that it doesn't really explain. So God seems to want a companionship with human beings that he created, something that's different than his relationship with the angels, who are purely his servants. But he creates man, and obviously he gives man a free will and an opportunity to do right on his own, but also the opportunity to do wrong. So we have man starting out doing wrong, sinning, and sin comes into the world. And from that time on, all of the descendants, all of the human beings that come from this beginning have that tendency to sin in their lives. So Abraham is interesting to us because God sees in him a potential. Now, when we see God picking something out and doing something, it's because he knows where this is going to go. He has a plan, the plan made before there even was a creation, we're told in several New Testament texts. And he sees now a time to begin that plan. So he begins it with the man Abraham. He finds him, why Abraham is attuned to God, we're not particularly told. I said last week that if Abraham was just a man who grew up with some awareness of these stories of God, we wonder where did all these stories come from? We sort of attribute them to Moses writing them. But it's very possible that that bits of them were, at least the story itself, were written down, and Abraham, the archaeologists have found an extensive library at Ur of the Chaldees. And so Abraham may have been a searching kind of person and began to read these stories. Or also, if you do the arithmetic of their long lives, you can see that Noah's son was still alive as an old man when Abraham was a young boy. Is it possible that Abraham somehow came in contact with this elderly man who can tell him personally about Noah and the flood? And Abraham begins to see this reality of God that others were not seeing. They had made their own gods. Someone said kind of facetiously that God made man, and then man has been returning the favor ever since by making gods. Yeah, that's what the ancient people did, and I guess what we still do is try to make God what we want God to be, what we think God ought to be. So we have all these gods over the years. Some of them they took some great human being that and when that human being died, they turned them into a god. Others, they began to observe nature. They saw, well, everything depends on the sun for light and heat, so the sun must be God. Well, then if the sun is God, maybe the moon is God. And I'm surprised in reading some of the archaeological findings that this moon god seemed to be a more significant god. Maybe they realized that the sun was awfully powerful, but the moon was more friendly. So the Babylonians, their chief god one of them was Marduk, who was like the founder of the Babylonian society. The other was a god that we would call Sin, S-I-N, Sin. But the Sin was the moon god. So the Sinai is the place of sin, but not sin as we think of it, the place of the moon god. So the moon god was very important to them. But Abraham said, no, these things are created. It's the one who created them who's God. So with this openness then, God appears to him. How he appeared to him, I cannot tell you. Did he actually see something physical from which God spoke, or did he just hear God's voice speaking to him? Or there are those who would say, well, it was all internal, that as he meditated about God, as he went back to these things that he could find that God had done in creation and in the flood, and in Enoch, who walked with God so closely that God took him and he didn't finish his life and die. He simply disappeared because God took him. Those kind of things perhaps interested Abram, and maybe in this he was so open to God that inwardly he began to understand this calling of God. How it all happened. But as we read on in Genesis, it seems that God speaks to him very directly. You'd almost read it, you would almost feel God speaks out in a voice out loud to him. God says, I will make you a great nation and I will bless you. Well, you could see maybe that Abraham might get visions of grandeur and think, well, I know God and God is blessing me, so he's going to make a great nation of me. But this is so specific that what the Bible is doing is not searching for God, that man is going to search for God until he finds him, but to show that God is revealing himself to men in a way that we could never find out who he is. We just need to receive his revelation of himself and trust in it. So that's what Abraham did. So In the 12th chapter, then, we finally get this communication between God and Abraham is promised. Paul really zeroes in on this promise that he's promised that the land that he will be seen will be his land. Well, there's still contention over that right today in our daily newspapers, but yet there it is. There's a people who say, God gave us this land, and then that he would have people, so many people descended from him that it would be like the sands on the seashore, uncountable, the stars in the heavens. So those things we see coming about. Now, I will bless those who bless you, and whoever curses you, I will curse. Well, you have to figure that one out from history to say, well, the Jewish people were often not seemingly blessed by God, but cursed by God because they did not live by his principles. But still, over and over again, the nations that cursed the Israelites just because they were God's people were themselves cursed. You see, in a way, you see the Jewish people and the Christians who come from them standing against the power of mighty Rome. There's never been such a mighty power in the world before, and yet as centuries go by, Rome is gone and they're still here. Same thing with Egypt. And then, of course, in our day, we think of the Holocaust, of the terrible slaughter of Jews just because they were Jews, and yet the nation that slaughtered them is defeated, and some of the Jews are rescued. So all of this is interesting. You read this and you see there's something to think deeply about here.
John, when we travel, I often will buy books at ports we've gone to and then read them later. And I brought it in a Bible study a couple of years ago, but I was reading this book on Portugal. And what struck me the most, it was a history of the Middle Ages. And of course, Portugal was at its strongest in 1500.
Yeah.
But it went country by country. As they became more anti-Semitic and they banned the Jews, the countries lost power.
Yeah.
It went from England to Germany, and then Portugal was kind of the last refuge for Jews before Turkey.
Yeah.
They went, and then when they threw them out, then Portugal started to sink. So even in the Middle Ages, it was interesting to watch this collapse of world international stature and power of various nations who became progressively more anti-Semitic and eventually banned the Jews from their country.
Yeah, with the Inquisition that we so abhor reading about was largely in Spain, and many Jews claimed to be Christians when they really weren't, in order to escape the Inquisition. But that's all now ancient history, and yet the history is interesting in regard to what God promises Abraham. Mm-hmm. So, okay, now we want to get the story a little bit before us here. So Abraham then, in the 12th chapter, finally, except that he takes Lot along, he finally leaves the rest of his family. And his family stays in this little place upriver that they actually named after Abraham's older brother who had died before they left Ur of the Chaldees, Haran or Charan. I was reading, the languages have different emphasis, and when you read things about ancient Hebrew, a word that starts with an H often is like, we talk about the Jewish celebration of Hanukkah, but sometimes you see it written Chanukah, CH. And that's kind of a peculiarity of moving from the Hebrew language to the English language. And that CH is pronounced, you hear people speaking Yiddish and you've got this strong sound in it. So anyway, Haran or Karen where they lived is still there, and we encounter it later in the story. But for now, Abram with Sarai, his wife, and Lot leave Haran. Now, we need to understand that it's very foolish of us to try to make judgments about Abraham's lifestyle from our modern perspective. Things were different in Abraham's day. Someone like Abram, who became very successful, who could manage herds and flocks and land, gathered up people around him, and the little people who couldn't do that became part of the households of the people who could do it. So Abraham gathers this household around him, the servants. It's a little difficult to tell who are voluntary servants and who are slaves in these early days, but he gathers this large household. He has flocks and herds, and he has people who care for them, and the people who help with pitching the tent and doing the work. So he's not really alone, if you would picture Abram and Sarah and Lot, just the three of them wandering down into the land. No, he comes in as somebody who's to be respected. So he moves into this land and he begins to look at it, but he's an outsider. He has a presence there, but he doesn't own anything. The land is not that heavily populated that there's places that he can go and camp with all of his people. So he moves through and he comes to a place called Shechem. These places are pretty much named after people who are the starting people there. So Shechem is a place where somebody named Shechem began as village, and it grew into a city. And it talks about the great tree of Morah. Great trees are mentioned several times in Abraham's story. So let's just say, that great trees in a land that was kind of semi-arid. There were very lush places for vegetation and things, but there were a lot of places that were, if the rain didn't come, were pretty dry. So if there was a great tree, it was very significant. And these several places, these great trees are mentioned. Now the pagan people, when they found a great tree like this, they thought, oh, it must be some God thing here. So they sort of worshiped the tree, or they made it a center of worship. And Abraham likes to sit in the shade of these trees, we find later. But it specifically says that Abraham built altars to God. Now, altars, did he sacrifice animals on them? We're never told very specifically about that, but we would assume that he practiced animal sacrifices as he knew it, as other peoples in the ancient world did. But other than that, an altar was simply a testimony to worship. He didn't make an image of God. We find later that God strictly forbids trying to make an image of him, trying to picture God in this way. But he put stones together and made an altar of some sort. So he begins to worship God. This says at that time the Canaanites were in the land. Now if we back up in our story, we see that Canaan is one of the grandsons of Noah. And from these grandsons of Noah, peoples developed. So the Canaanites, various tribes of Canaanites, had settled in this land that we call the Holy Lands now, or Palestine. We name Palestine. The word comes from the Philistines, who were one of the tribes that came into this, but it's often called Canaan after the Canaanites, who were the people who lived there way back into antiquity. So the land was populated by Canaanites. They weren't necessarily a very good people by our kinds of standards, but they apparently weren't a terribly aggressive people. For Abraham was always sort of treated kindly by them. So anyway, he keeps moving through the land, moving south. And at the south end of the land is an area called the Negev, that is high plateaus above the Dead Sea that become very significant. When Jesus went into the wilderness, when John the Baptist was raised in the wilderness, this was the wilderness. And Abraham moves there. Even in that wilderness, there would be places that his herds could feed. So, but then as he gets down to that end of the country, a drought is in the country, a famine. Things are not growing. So what do we expect Abraham to do? Well, he should trust God, shouldn't he? And say, God, you sent me here, now you take care of me. But instead, he goes to Egypt. Now, you can say, well, that wasn't really very faithful on Abraham's part. Or you can say, God sort of does things at times or allows things to be done that look forward. So Abraham going into Egypt looks forward to the fact that the whole family will move into Egypt and for 400 years will be in Egypt, become slaves of the Egyptians, and then come out of Egypt not as a family but as a nation. And later then we have this kind of mysterious thing in Matthew's gospel where when Herod tries to kill the baby Jesus, when the wise men come and tell him that a king's been born, he tries to kill this baby king so it won't grow up and be his rival. And Joseph is told by an angel in a dream to flee, to get out of Herod's jurisdiction. So he goes to Egypt. And then when an angel comes and tells him that Herod has died, he can go back. He comes back out of Egypt, and Matthew quotes an Old Testament text that says, out of Egypt I have called my son. But the Old Testament text originally refers to the whole Jewish nation. So, but now you can see how God sort of does these things that when you look at them from the other side are sort of hints of what's going to happen. So he goes into Egypt, and we have this strange story, and now again we would say, Abraham, you're supposed to be the man of great faith. He says, the Egyptians have this reputation, not only the Egyptians, other peoples as well, that when they see a beautiful woman, and apparently Sarai, even though she's in her 80s, is still a beautiful woman. And I would say women can be beautiful in their 80s. But
better.
I better. So, in this time of long life, 80s was just like our 40s or 50s would be. So she's a beautiful woman, and she's had no children because we've been told early on, in spite of the fact that God keeps talking to Abraham about making a great nation, mighty people of him, he has no children. Sarah can't have children, apparently. And so he says to Sarah, I guess they'd made this pact early on. We're going, I don't know what we're going to run into, but tell him you're my sister. Well, then finally we have an explanation later on that actually Sarah is Abraham's half-sister because she also is a daughter of Terah, Abraham's father, but by a different wife. You say, well, wait a minute, they shouldn't be marrying close relatives. At that time, that wasn't any problem. Later on, it becomes a problem through the gathering of genetic weaknesses through marrying your close relatives. But anyway, say you're my sister. So she does. And so instead of killing the husband so that they can free the beautiful wife to be taken into the Pharaoh's harem, they just take her into the Pharaoh's harem. And Abraham's given gifts, her brother. Yes, here, have some more flocks and herds and gold and silver. So then God intervenes. The Lord inflicted serious diseases on Pharaoh and his household because of Abram's wife Sarah. Now, God apparently not only did this, but he revealed to them why he was doing it, because the Pharaoh then seems to understand and calls Abram and says, why did you do this to me? Why did you cause me this trouble? Saying that your wife was your sister. So here, take your wife and take these other gifts, more herds and flocks, and get out of here. So God is involved in this. He doesn't stay in Egypt at this time. He's supposed to go back and continue his journeys. So he goes back, and now Lot, his nephew who's with him, has himself gathered up. He's part of this, so he's given gifts, and Abram starts him, and he has flocks and herds and people that are caring for them. And there's not enough pasture readily available, so the herdsmen are battling over who gets the pasture. And Abraham says to Lot, this shouldn't be. We're brethren here, we're relatives, we're family. So let's separate. You go where you want to go. Wherever you go, I'll go somewhere else. We see a kind of a graciousness about Abraham here. He's the older one. He's the more established one. And yet he says to Lot, you pick. And Lot looks at the Jordan Valley, well watered by the Jordan River, coming down toward the Dead Sea, the lowest place on earth, I'm told. No water flows out of the Dead Sea. That's why it's dead. But he sees here some very prosperous people and lush green pasture. So he says, I'll go there. And Abram says, okay, then I'll go the other direction. Abram goes to a place called Hebron. That's still a nice place, but closer to the desert. So then we have this next chapter, chapter 15, we go back to God dealing specifically with Abram. So I've rescued you from Egypt, and you're back in the land where I wanted you to be. So it's time to confirm this relationship. After this, the word of the Lord came to Abram in a vision. Now, a vision is a little different. A vision is not, I'm here doing something and I hear the voice of God. A vision is I'm sitting quietly, and all of a sudden it's kind of like a dream when you're not asleep. I'm seeing these things and then I come out of it and I realize, well, I was seeing things by means of this vision. Now I realize that people who see things that aren't there now are treated to get rid of that, but visions were something understood by the ancient people, and I'm not saying that there are not people. I've read and heard that Muslim people at times have visions in which they're told that they should seek Jesus, and they do and become Christians. Well, I'm not about to deny that those are genuine visions from the Lord. So Abram has a vision. Having just come out of Egypt and done this thing about protecting himself by saying Sarah was his sister, God says to him, do not be afraid, Abram. What are you seem to be operating out of fear. Do not be afraid, Abram. I am your shield, your very great reward. You don't need to seek something from the Egyptians or from anybody else. I am your shield and your very great reward. But Abram said, now in the vision, he talks to God, talks back to God. If you have times when you talk back to God, don't let that worry you. It's better to talk back to God than not to talk to God at all. And God can handle it. He's not afraid of being talked back to. O sovereign Lord, what can you give me since I remain childless? God, you keep talking about me being this great father, and yet I don't have a child. what are you doing, God? Why aren't you doing what you should here? So he says, my inheritance will go to this servant of mine, Eliezer of Damascus. Now, we don't know anything about Eliezer of Damascus, except that he was apparently the chief foreman and close person to Abraham, not apparently related to him by blood, as we would say, but by business. It says Eliezer of Damascus. Damascus is an ancient city of the Aramaic people, also from Aram as a descendant of in the genealogies. And you have given me no children, so a servant of my household will be my heir. Then the word of the Lord came to him. This man will not be your heir. God doesn't have any trouble speaking back when he's challenged. But a son coming from your own body will be your heir. So this is where God takes him outside. Go outside and look up. What do you see? Look at the heavens and count the stars, if indeed you can count them. Then he said, so shall your offspring be. God uses figures. He says, Abram, look at the stars. That's how many children you will have. Now this is where, it's this 6th verse of chapter 15 that Paul quotes a couple of times, and the book of Hebrews quotes, and it's a great verse because it's the beginning of grace. It's the beginning of God saying, okay, I'm going to fix this in my own way. Abram believed the Lord, and he, the Lord, credited it to him as righteousness. A little bookkeeping kind of idea here. Abraham, I don't see you as being so good that I have to do things for you. But I see that since I am good, I'm going to do things for you. So I'm going to forget, I'm going to forgive and pass over the things that you do. And I'm going to count as if you did everything perfectly. I'm going to credit it to you for righteousness. I'm going to treat you as somebody who is righteous beyond what you really are. That's in the New Testament what we call grace. So he said, I am the Lord who brought you out of Ur of the Chaldees to give you this land to take possession of it. But Abraham said, O sovereign Lord, how can I know that I will gain possession of it? Now, we're told that Abram was like 75 years old, of a life that lasts until he's 180, I think. So he's not really old by their perspective, but he's along in years. And then 10 years pass, and nothing's happening. And now God is saying to him again, I'm going to do this. And he says, but God, how can I know? So we have this wonderful thing in the 15th chapter of a kind of an ancient ceremony that God puts him through. God says, okay, bring me some animals, dead animals, killed animals, and cut them in half. Put the two halves over here, and a couple of young doves or pigeons, and he puts one killed pigeon on one pile and one on the other. And Adam brought all these, cut them in two, and arranged the halves opposite each other. The birds, however, he did not cut in half. The birds, and then vultures or eagles or something come down smelling this blood, and they're going to try to eat some of this, and Abram chases them away. The birds of prey came down on the carcasses, but Abram drove them away. As the sun was setting, Abram fell into a deep sleep, and a thick and dreadful darkness came over him. Not all visions are comfortable. So he feels this darkness that is representative of the wrath of God, of evil. And then the Lord said to him, know for certain that your descendants will be strangers in a country not their own, and they will be enslaved and mistreated 400 years. So in this vision, God says to him, yes, this land's going to be yours, but only after your people are enslaved in another land for 400 years, which of course happens, we know. But I will punish the nation they serve as slaves, and afterward they will come out with great possessions. You, however, will go to your fathers in peace and be buried at a good old age. In the 4th generation, your descendants will come back here. For the sin of the Amorites, now the Amorites are one of these further tribes that occupy the land. So it's Canaanites, it's Amorites, it's lots of Imzanites. And the sin of the Amorites has not yet reached its full measure. This is, if you want to see what we learn about God, he says, okay, the time will come when I will do away with the people that are in this land, drive them out or put them out, and I will give the land to you, but I will do that because of their sinfulness, and they're not that sinful yet. It's going to take 400 more years before but God knows they will become. So he says, when the sun had set and darkness had fallen, a smoking pot with a blazing torch appeared and passed between the pieces. On that day the Lord made a covenant with Abram and said, to your descendants I will give this land, from the river of Egypt. Now, I've been told the river of Egypt we would think is the Nile, but there was a smaller river that was more the border of Egypt that was called the river of Egypt. And from the river of Egypt to the great river Euphrates. Now you see, actually the Jews never held all that land all the way to the Euphrates until David and Solomon's time. Eventually they did for a short time. The land of, now here's all these people, the Kenites, the Kenizzites, the Canaanites, the Hittites, the Perizzites, the Rephaites, the Amorites, the Canaanites, the Girgashites, and the Jebusites. All these were tribes of people, city groups that lived in this land. So, now, you notice he said to Abram, this servant will not be your heir, but someone from your own loins. So Abraham was the man of great faith who believed God, and yet, in chapter 16, his wife says, you know, I'm getting older and older, and there's still no child. I've got this young woman, Egyptian woman, who's my servant, and I will give her to you, Abraham, as a second wife, which was apparently very okay in that day. And she will have the child. And this is how we'll do that. And ever since we've been saying, okay, God, you promised me this, but I don't see you giving it to me, so I'll get it. And then I'll say you gave it to me. So anyway, this doesn't appear to be one of the great things of righteousness that Abraham and Sarai display. So she does that. Abraham agreed to what Sarah said. In 1 Peter says, all you women who want to be righteous, you should be like Sarah. Well, he means Sarah, who trustingly went with Abraham on all these adventures and finally became the mother of the covenant people. But not everything Sarah does is to be imitated. So, but notice how Abram, he's not the first husband, or certainly not the last, to say, okay, honey, whatever you want. So anyway, he does what she says. But when the servant becomes pregnant with Abraham's child, then she says, wait a minute. Sarah, you've got everything. I've got very little as your servant, but I've got Abraham's child. So she begins to speak up and make her mistress unhappy with this and wish she'd never done it. Then verse 5 says, then Sarah said to Abraham, you're responsible for this wrong. You did this. Now you fix it. I'm suffering. I put my servant in your arms, and now that she knows she's pregnant, she despises me. May the Lord judge between you and me. Interesting. And Abraham says, she's your servant. You fix it. Your servant is in your hands, he said. Do with her whatever you think best. Then Sarah mistreated Hagar, and so she fled from her. Okay, now Abraham makes quite a point in Galatians about this being one of these sort of history parables that there's a son born to the slave woman and there's a son born to the wife, but ultimately the son born to the slave woman is put away, and the son born by promise to the wife becomes the true heir. And he says, see, that's the way it is. The law is a matter of sort of enslaving you to right ways. The law is put away, and the new gift that comes from God's true Son is yours. He makes this analogy in Galatians. So, but look at what we learn about God from this. So, the servant, Egyptian servant, Hagar, says, well, I'm going to run away then if you're going to treat me like this, and she does. So she runs off into the desert, and she finds a spring of water and sort of hangs out there, and down toward Egypt, where she came from, and then God says, Hagar, servant of Sarai, where have you come from and where are you going? God is not uncaring for her, and he certainly recognizes that this child is Abraham's child. I'm running away from my mistress Sarai, she answers. Then the angel of the Lord. Now it's interesting, the Jews always believe that you can't really talk to God, he's too great. But angels are the messengers. So the angel of the Lord told her, go back to your mistress and submit to her. The angel says, I will so increase your descendants that they will be too numerous to count. You as one of your child will be Abraham's child, and I'll extend this promise to him, that his descendants will be numerous. The angel of the Lord also said to her, you are now with child, and you will have a son. You shall name him Ishmael, for the Lord has heard of your misery. Ishmael is a name that, if you sound it out, sounds like God hears. The L at the end of these things is God. Ishmael, God hears. He will be a wild donkey of a man. His hand will be against everyone, and everyone's hand against him. And he will live in hostility toward all his brothers. So now if you were a Muslim, the Muslims would say, we are the descendants of Abraham through Ishmael, his true son, his first son. And that's why we're against everybody, because you're all enemies. You're all need to be destroyed because you're not the true people. So it all comes back to interpretation of the book of Genesis. So anyway, she does go back, and the child is born, and Abraham really loves this son of his, and he cares for him. Now, we're running out of time, so we're going to have to stop here. Chapter 17, God gives the sign of circumcision, which is given to Ishmael, who's now 13 or so, and then later to Isaac when he's born, and to all of the household. Not all of those who were Abraham's children, but all of his servants are all part of this covenant that God makes with him. So we'll start there next week, the covenant of circumcision, and then the visit of the three visitors and the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah, which we touched on last week. And then we want to get quickly to Isaac, the promised one. And we have some great things that God is doing and saying to us, I think, through Isaac's role in this. So that will be where we'll take up next. So questions to leave with me? Again, I'm doing all the talking, and that's not my intention. Have anything that you want to ask about or add to this idea? But you do see that Genesis is a book of foundations. It's a book that God put there because we really need to have some depth of understanding of where this all comes from. And I think an understanding of how God has acted in the past so that we understand something of God's ways of doing things. So that's what we'll continue to study. We're going to finish on through the book of Genesis, and we have some great stories. Isaac, and then Jacob is a great character. He's the one who's renamed Israel and becomes the father of Israel, the Israelites. And then, of course, Joseph is the last great character in the book, and his story is tremendous. So all of that is ahead. So let's close in prayer. Father, thank you for your word. Thank you for the opportunity for us to see the things that you have done and planned and the way that you have done things in the past, so we may understand more deeply that you are our God and you are the one who does what needs to be done, but in your own way and in your own time. May we have the kind of faith that Abraham and the patriarchs had of trusting to see what you are going to do. So bless us as we worship you today in Jesus' name. Amen.